Hello and welcome to the Tank Club, and welcome to our New World tank build. If you are interested in New World tanking, you can find our huge MMO tank community over at the Tank Club Discord, where you can also see discussions on tank topics and get help if you need any help with anything. You can watch live point of view tanking from New World on our Twitch channel, and for written builds, guides, information, we have the tankclub.com. All the links are in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the future New World Tank videos and information that are going to be on the way soon. So let's start by saying that this build has newer and progressive tanks in mind. There are many ways to tank in New World with different abilities, different weapons and different gear weights, but there is a huge difference in getting into tanking and using the group finder lobby compared to skill pushing expeditions with an organised group. You can tank using light armor and a rapier, but it doesn't mean you should, especially if you're not at an elite level of both tanking ability and New World tank knowledge, and also don't have the group to accommodate that. We'll do some deep dives into more advanced topics within the coming weeks as we look at different weapons, abilities, and theory craft other builds for endgame score pushing and raid bosses, but for right now, this is what we're going to be doing. So the very first thing we're going to look at is our attributes. For your attributes, the best option is to use 300 strength or more combined with 200 constitution. 300 strength gives you grit, which is really important. It prevents you from getting knocked back, so you can hold your position much better while using light and heavy attacks. You need to be using light and heavy attacks a lot as a tank because it's basically impossible to permanently block as a tank in New World. So to maintain your stamina, you need to drop block for large portions of time during combat. You don't want bosses to be throwing you around the room, so you want to be doing light and heavy attacks to give you that grit, to hold your position, and you're going to be face tanking quite a lot of damage. Grit is also very valuable since the most essential perks on your sword, it's Refreshing Ward, which reduces your ability cooldowns from light and heavy attacks, so you want to make use of that. And your other weapons benefit greatly as well from doing regular light and heavy attack. 200 constitution is very useful as it unlocks increased resistances, and it also provides you with more health. Increasing constitution past 200 doesn't really offer a huge benefit. You'll gain increased health, but the attribute bonuses aren't as useful as the grit that you get from 300 strength. Now, if you did want to play the safer option, then you can go with 300 constitution and 200 strength, but it'll be way less effective, and you'll notice that you are getting knocked back and thrown around a lot more, which isn't very nice. So the weapons that you could use for tanking in New World, there are a range of options. Some of my favourites include Sword and Shield with Warhammer, Sword and Shield with Great Axe, and Sword and Shield with Hatchet. Now, other weapons you can use include things like the Great Sword and the Ice Gauntlet. Sword and Shield is quite essential for PvE tanking. It offers too many benefits to you as a tank, which assist you in damage reduction amongst other things, and if you take the leadership route, it's also going to offer you increased group damage passively, which is something you don't really want to lose. The Warhammer is a great utility weapon with the Rend and the Weaken alongside crowd control, so it's going to increase the damage that your group do and decrease the damage that the enemy does, and it's going to help you with controlling enemies and keeping them all grouped up so your group can do more damage. It's a really hard weapon to lose because it has so many benefits, and it's also a really nice high damage tank weapon which will help you keep up your threat and aggro of enemies. The Great Axe is something you can use to help stack enemies and help your group to burn down enemies faster. Ideally, you only use this in situations where there's lots of enemies so you can bunch them up for your damage dealers and when somebody else in your group isn't using one. Hatchets are used by tanks to introduce additional methods of AoE taunting and damage, which leads to improved aggro and threat. You obviously got some nice little debuffs on there as well. You would often use this weapon choice when doing additional DPS and things like that as well as a tank. The Great Sword is commonly asked about as a tank weapon. I personally don't feel like it's good enough to replace the Sword and Shield, and you don't really want to use it with the Sword and Shield because you'll lose way too much fight control, you'll lose way too many debuffs, and they're kind of similar in a way in how they function. You would end up losing way too much utility, for example, by dropping the Warhammer or the Great Axe in place of the Great Sword. So I mostly use a Great Sword personally when completing overland content. It's a good tanky DPS weapon, but yes, you can complete content with it, but if you're a newer tank, if you're kind of just on that progressive route, using the Great Sword I don't think is going to be a great option. Finally, the Ice Gauntlet is an option for kind of DPS tanking. It's not really common to use it unless you're in a really organized group and using light armor. So we're going to look first of all at the sword and shield, and we're going to look more at the defensive options. So there's kind of 4 different ways to set this up. The skills that I'm using here are Reverse Stab, Shield Bash, and Defender's Resolve. The sword and shield is an excellent weapon choice for tanking in New World and should be your main hand weapon of choice. You have access to 2 taunts, plus a lot of defensive benefits. If you go with the defensive option, you'll benefit yourself more, and that's the best option when you're kind of newer to tanking or content with random groups. We'll look at the little passives here. So it's very important with Reverse Stab to also pick up the passives, so you get Grit, and then also here, Tactician is the reason why you use this skill. So you will reduce the cooldowns of your other skills by 25%. So reduce the cooldown on these long duration skills because you're using this. To get to this, you have to pick up one of these passives. So you have to pick, this is the only one available if you haven't took this skill here. So that's why we go with Opportunist. And then obviously we need a skill here as well. Either one of those will do, but I went with the heavy attack to get that Empower. With the Shield Bash, now this is not a must-use skill. I personally use it because when I'm in a group, a lot of the time people don't stack up like they're supposed to. People are spread out, and then I have to go and find a way to go and pick up enemies in multiple different areas. So I like to use Shield Bash, especially on things like archers, to run over, hit them with the Shield Bash to taunt them, and also so that I can stop them from doing their attacks to the healers and the group members. So that's why I use this. But another good option is to use Shield Rush, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The other skill I like to use is Defender's Resolve. Obviously we get reduced incoming damage, we have Grit on there, and then when we look at the passives, we get damage reduction, we get a heal, it does a taunt without actually hitting anything. So all enemies within 8 meters get taunted for 8 seconds. It does have a long cooldown, and that is why we obviously use this Tactician passive here. Now, like I said before, this is the more defensive option because we are going to get things like additional armor. We are going for pretty much every passive here that we can take. There isn't any benefit to getting the increased threat from this. This is just a taunt. We don't use it for the threat. The threat increase isn't that useful. And also this one isn't really useful either. So increases the stun duration by 1 second. It's a bit of a waste of a point. So we take all of the passives there and we get like a kind of added bonus there while blocking reduces damage to all allies within 2 meters. So I find this quite useful for those beginner groups, but it's not so good when you're in a more advanced group. Now here is the more offensive type of playing this same kind of setup, and we kind of take a lot of the Sword Master passives here, and the only reason for that is because we're trying to get this leadership passive. While holding a sword, the damage of all group members is increased by 10%. So that's why you want to try and unlock this leadership passive. For those higher end groups, for those organized groups, you don't need as many defensive benefits because you might have a good healer. The damage is really high, so enemies die faster. So a lot of the defensive perks from the defender tree aren't as useful. So the Sword Master passives then become kind of nice because they are more damage orientated, and then you get a nice damage buff for your group as well. When using your sword and shield skills, the way you kind of use them is you always make sure that the first skill that you use from your sword and shield is your Defender's Resolve, to make sure that you've got that really, really high cooldown ability and it's ticking away and the cooldown is ticking. You want to pick off any kind of enemies that are away from the stack or anything that is causing damage to your group with Shield Bash. And then once you cast those 2 abilities, that's when you cast your Reverse Stab, because you want to be making sure that you're reducing the cooldowns. Now, you should never go into a fight and use Defender's Resolve. It's better to use a skill that's doing damage and creating threat and taunt. So something like Shockwave with your Warhammer, for example, is a far better skill to lead into combat. And you should always be going in with light and heavy attacks before casting these taunt skills, because you need to increase your threat, then do the taunt, so the enemies don't all run off once your taunt expires. Now, another way to play this build is Shield Bash deals 50% weapon damage, so it only does half the damage that is possible from your character. So that means that you don't create a very high amount of threat by using Shield Bash. So if you don't need this extra taunt, you could use Shield Rush. Now, Shield Rush will rush forward, staggering, pushing enemies, and it deals 125% weapon damage. So this does more threat than Shield Bash. And when you look at the passives, you do weaken to enemies when they're hit by this, and on successful hit, all enemies are slowed. Now, the reason why this works so well When you use it with the Fortifying Shield Rush perk on your gear or your shield, this gives you some really nice benefits. So if you use this alongside a tower shield, after hitting a target with Shield Rush, you gain Fortify, increasing damage absorption on self by 33% for 6 seconds. If you then combine this with things that will increase the duration of your Fortify, you can get a really high amount of Fortify, and this is a more common thing that I'm starting to see, but this is only good if you're not needing that second taunt. In terms of weapon perks, Refreshing Move is pretty much essential for your sword. Then you want to go with something like Thwarting Strikes if you have 300 or more strength, Enchanted if you're under 300 strength. A Bane perk is very, very useful, so Ancient Bane, Angry Earth Bane, Corrupted Bane, or Lost Bane. Other perks, things such as Life Stealing, are very good as well. In terms of your gem, you want to cut Pristine Carnelian Gem in this weapon because you have to have that to be able to taunt enemies. If you have a really high threat generation and you're able to maintain that really well, you're not losing aggro of enemies, you could potentially use a Rune Glass of Energizing Carnelian, although I wouldn't generally advise it because you are going to get 50% less threat on this weapon by using that. However, you will get a bit more stamina recovery, so maybe for people who are keeping taunt well and keeping good aggro and threat of enemies, you could use that for the bit of increased stamina, but I personally don't. In terms of your tower shield perks, it's better to always go with the tower shield rather than the round shield or the kite shield. Sturdy for me is an essential perk on your shield. You've got to have that because it reduces the amount of stamina it takes to block an attack. Refreshing is a really useful perk to have as well to reduce your cooldowns. Sturdy Energy, you can use it on your shield or one of your pieces of gear depending on how you've got that, but Sturdy Energy is a very, very good perk as well for increasing the stamina gain. Having a ward on your shield, again, something that is really, really useful. So Angry Earth Ward, Ancient Ward, Lost Ward, or Corrupted Ward. So depending on what situation you're in, what expedition you're doing, if you're doing Genesis and Barnacles, last boss, Angry Earth Ward. Ancient Ward is really good for Lazarus, Starstone, Ennead. Corrupted Ward's really good for Dynasty, Tempest, Depths, and Ennead after the first boss and before the last boss. And then Lost Ward is really good for Barnacles before the last boss. Fortifying Shield Rush as well is a great option to use if you're using the Shield Rush ability. The next weapon I like to use is the Warhammer. And the abilities we use here, we've got Armor Breaker. And the main reason for using this is because when we pick up these passives here, we get Rend, which reduces the target's damage absorption, which means your damage that your group are doing is going to be increased to enemies that have this applied to them. So you have to keep this debuff up as much as possible because your group will do more damage. We've got Wrecking Ball, which is for crowd control. So it's a nice AoE skill that will deal 130% weapon damage, so it increases your threat, but it also knocks enemies down. It's better than using something like Clear Out. So Clear Out will push enemies away, which is what you don't want to do. You want enemies to be stacked up and crowd controlled on the spot. So that's what this will do. So Wrecking Ball, really, really good skill for doing that. Then you've got Shockwave, and this is a fantastic skill. So you slam the hammer into the ground, stagger and stun enemies. You get weakened, so you debuff the enemies, you reduce the damage that they're doing. A bigger radius there with that passive as well. So this is a great skill to go into combat. It deals 80% weapon damage, it's a taunt, it applies weaken. And if you have Sundering Shockwave on a piece of your gear, then you're also going to inflict Rend, which is going to increase the target's damage absorption by 14% for 10 seconds. So potentially, if you have Sundering Shockwave and you go into combat with this Shockwave ability with your passives, you're going to be creating quite a lot of debuffs onto the enemies as an area of an effect. In terms of your other passives, obviously we've got a lot of different ones here. There's a lot of useful passives that benefit from heavy attacks. Increased damage absorption. We've got reduce hammer cooldowns by 7% using light attacks against targets with an active debuff, so we can do that. Increased damage. We've got heal yourself when using the Crowd Crusher ability, so this one here. We have to take this one because we can't get down to this skill without taking this passive. On the other side, like I said before, we've got to take these for the Rend. You gain Fortify when using Wrecking Ball, so obviously we're going to get reduced damage. And increased radius there as well. And then things like increased armor pen, empower from heavy attacks, grit from heavy attacks. So we've already got grit anyway, but we get also grants 12% damage reduction while grit is active. So we get reduced damage because we have grit. Heavy attack damage is increased, cooldowns are increased from heavy attacks, extra damage after receiving damage. So this weapon does a huge amount of damage for you as a tank, but it also provides a lot of group benefits. If you have a group member using a spear, then you won't need to use the Armor Breaker ability because Rend will be covered. So in that case, you can use Mighty Gavel instead. The way you use these abilities is when you go into combat, do some light and heavy attacks and follow it up with a shockwave pretty soon after initiating combat, and it will taunt and increase your threat on the enemies. It'll stagger them and it'll do a load of debuffs. You want to be heavy attacking in between using your abilities with your Warhammer, and then you want to be making sure you keep up your Armor Breaker to apply that Rend, and then a Wrecking Ball to pin down enemies when they're stacked up. In terms of your perks on your Warhammer, Bane, again, you want to have Ancient Bane, Angry Earth Bane, Corrupt Bane, or Lost Bane as one of your main things because it's going to increase the amount of damage you do into those enemy types. You want to have Trenchant Strikes on there as well. Sundering Shockwave if you don't have it on any other gear piece. And then things like Keen, Vicious, or Keenly Empowered are also good weapon perks that you can take on your Warhammer. In terms of your gem, again, a Cut Pristine Carnelian is essential. If you are not needing that, then the other option is to use a Rune Glass of Leech in Carnelian, which will return some health back when you do damage with that Warhammer. So that is an option that you can use as well, but it's advised to use the Pristine Carnelian to maintain the higher levels of threat, and if you're doing a really good job of doing that, that's when you can switch over to the Rune Glass. When it comes to the Great Axe, we use Reap, Maelstrom, and Gravity Well. The Great Axe is fantastic when used in situations with multiple enemies, mostly adpulls. It offers a huge amount of crowd control to stack up the enemies, which allow your group to do a lot more AoE DPS. I'm not going to go too much into details with this because my preferred options would be to use the Warhammer and the One-Hand and Shield. If somebody else in your group is using a Great Axe, you don't really need to, but Reap is obviously really good. It pulls enemies in, and it taunts them as well. Maelstrom spins around, it pulls enemies in. Gravity Well, it roots enemies, it pulls them in. So it's a good option, but I'm not going to go too much into detail. I'll have a separate video on specific things about this in the future, but it's an option. It's not one that I think is quite as good as using the Warhammer. So same thing again, we've got the Hatchet. It's another good option. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the skills here, we've got Berserk, we've got Raging Torrent, and we've got Infected Throw. This can be a really good option. So Berserk is an AoE taunt where you don't have to hit an enemy to activate it. It just picks up everything within an 8-meter radius. So if you want to have easy AoE taunting of enemies, using a Sword and Shield and a Hatchet means you've got two quite big AoE taunts. Raging Torrent is really important because it does 4 fast attacks, and when you combine that with the Refreshing Torrent perk on your gear, this reduces your cooldowns of your other skills. And then Infected Throw, it applies Weaken, reducing the target's outgoing damage, which is really useful as well. For your gear, you want to run heavy armor to achieve a heavy equip load and a tower shield as well. When you are experienced and have an organized group, using light or medium is also an option for advanced tanking for skull pushing. The equipment perks you use depend on what weapon you're using, so you should try to utilize the best ones for each weapon type, and you only need one specific weapon perk since they don't stack. So if you've got Sundering Shockwave, for example, it doesn't stack. It's just a one and done kind of thing. So if you have it on one piece of gear, you don't need it on a second piece, it will not stack. The function that gives with the increased Rend stacks. You can stack up different sources of Rend, but you can't stack up Sundering Shockwave as a buff. You are going to need more than one set of gear to be able to perform optimally as a tank. You need ward gear, which gives you reduced damage against certain enemy types. You'll need at least 4 sets of armor, each one with one of the 4 wards, so Ancient Ward, Angry Earth Ward, Corrupted Ward, and Lost Ward. Make sure you check out my other videos and also thetankclub.com. We have guides on where to find this ward gear and how to get it, so you can get yourself straight into those mutated expeditions and start progressing. There's some really easy to farm stuff, especially for Ancient, so Ancient ward gear is quite easy to find. That would be a good place to start. When it comes to amulets, you'll also need a few different options there. So when you go into mutated expeditions, they have certain damage bonuses to the enemy, which you can build resistance against by using one of the following perks on your amulet. So you can use Flame, Frozen, Nature, or Void Ward, which reduces your incoming damage from those specific elements by quite a large amount. So it can be useful at the start when you first start progressing mutated expeditions to have an amulet that has those specific wards on, along with the gem against that ward, so you get a huge amount of damage reduction. Okay, so armor. If we look at armor perks, you do want to focus on strength and constitution, so you need to use gear with those attributes. You'll obviously need to adjust your food, your attributes, and everything to accommodate what values you get from your gear. So sometimes you'll get gear that's just got constitution, other times it'll be just strength, and then sometimes it'll be a combination of both. And when that happens, you still want to reach 300 strength and 200 con, so you'll have to adjust food and attributes to accommodate that. In terms of your armor perks, you want to have ward gear. You can do expeditions, you can do mutated expeditions without ward gear, but when you want to start progressing into the later ones, the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you're definitely going to want to have some ward gear. It really, really helps. It reduces that damage down from the enemy types. So, Angry Earth Ward, really good for Genesis and Barnacle's last boss. Ancient Ward for Lazarus, Starstone and Ennead, the first and last boss. And then Corrupted Ward, Dynasty, Tempest, Depths and Ennead after the first boss and before the last boss. And then Lost Ward, which is the least useful one. Amarine Excavation has Lost Ward, and then Barnacles before the last boss as well. The next perk you want after that is Refreshing. This is important to use if possible to reduce your ability cooldowns. It's better to use Refreshing rather than other versions of... There's a number of different refreshing perks like Refreshing Move, Refreshing Ward, Refreshing Evasion. They're nowhere near as good as just bog standard Refreshing. Refreshing will just reduce your cooldowns as a basic value, and it's at 100% active because it's reducing them at all times. Things like Refreshing Evasion, for example, it reduces your cooldowns after dodging. So you have to dodge, and if you don't dodge, it's not going to do anything. The same with Refreshing Ward. Your active cooldowns are reduced after being hit. If you're not being hit, it's not doing anything, it's inactive. So you want to use Refreshing because it's 100% activity. It's always reducing your cooldowns, so it's obviously got a much higher benefit. Aside from your Ward and Refreshing, other good perks to have. So when using a Sword and Shield, you want to have Accelerated Defender's Resolve as one of your perks on your gear if you can. That would be number 1. Number 2 would be Diminishing Shield Bash. And then number 3, Contagious Reverse Stab. So if you can get those perks on your gear, they would be really, really useful to buff up your abilities. And then when using a Warhammer, you want to have Sundering Shockwave. You want to have that as like your priority number 1. You want to have that on a piece of gear. Empowering Armor Breaker again, another one, and then Penetrating Wrecking Ball. Those are like your primary things to put onto your gear. So you want to go, essentially your gear should have Ward, it should have Refreshing, and then one of those weapon buffing perks. Other useful perks that you can use on your gear include Elemental Aversion, Physical Aversion, Invigorated. Not the best. It's not best in slot, but it's still useful. So those aren't best in slot, but they are still useful. Sturdy Energy is sometimes used on the chest piece, because if you don't have it on your shield, it's nice to have that perk somewhere else. So some people let's use that on one of the pieces of gear if they don't have it on their shield. As I mentioned before, we do have guides on the tankclub.com for Ancient Ward gear, Corrupt gear, Angry Earth gear, where to find those specific gear types. That gear is not best in slot though, it's just easy to farm and it'll have the ward. You do want to eventually try and progress to picking up best in slot gear, but it's not essential to have best in slot gear to start progressing the harder content. You just want to have some gear that has benefits, like I say, with a ward on there, with some kind of refreshing, with some kind of benefits, physical and elemental of it. It doesn't matter if it's got those things on, they are still quite useful, they're just not best in slot. In terms of your gems, so for general, overland and base expedition, so non-mutated, just use full cut pristine onyx gems on your gear. For mutated expeditions, there's kind of 2 ways to set up. Now you could go with all of your gear using opal gems, and this is going to give you general cover for all types of mutated expeditions. And the way that this works is if you socket opal gems in everything apart from your amulet, and then you use a specific, let's say it's a flame mutation, you wear flame protection on your amulet with a flame gem, so a ruby gem, and then all of your other gear is in opal, that's going to give you general cover. And it also means you don't need to keep switching your gem every single mutation. So your resistance against a certain element type is kind of limited to about 50%. It's like a bit of a soft cap of 50%. And if you were to do this kind of setup with the opal gems and then the protection, that's going to give you around 33.5% damage reduction against, let's say, flame, for example. So this is a good general way of doing it without having to switch your gems every single week for when the mutation changes to a different element type. If you didn't want to do that, if you wanted to try and push yourself to that 50% resistance cap, then you would need to use individual types of gem depending on the mutation. So amethyst against void mutations, amber against nature, aquamarine against ice, and ruby against fire. If you slot all those into every single slot of gear and you're using a protection amulet, then you would see yourself pushing towards that 50% cap. If you've got a kind of generalized gear setup, you can use a rune glass of punishing onyx. You can put that rune glass with different gems as well if you wanted to, but it'll provide additional DPS with each one, increasing melee damage by 1%. So if you wanted to do a bit more damage, you can go with the rune glass, but they're going to be expensive, especially if you're going to be switching for mutated expeditions. But yeah, if you want, the best thing to do is just kind of look at the damage types that you're dealing with. If you're in a mutation, use the mutation specific gem types. That's going to really help you to get through them with receiving less damage. In terms of your jewelry, so your amulet perks, you really want to have health as a vital perk. Increased health is extremely useful for a tank. Refreshing is another useful perk, again like we got it on the rest of the gear. Refreshing is really useful. A protection perk is really nice, so same as the shield wards, flame, frozen, nature, void wards, which reduce damage from those specific elements by quite a large amount. So it's an easy way to get good damage reduction to the mutation types for the expeditions. Other useful perks, things like Divine, which boosts your incoming healing, and Fortified is another really good one when you are using the Shield Rush and Fortifying Shield Rush perk. Ring perks, Hearty is vital for the increased max stamina. And then other good perks, Refreshing, reduced cooldowns is obviously always useful. You got Leeching, which is nice for a little bit of health returned. A damage perk can be used here, so increase slash damage if you want to do a bit more DPS. And then Enfeebling, if you wanted to go a bit more down the defensive route. On your earrings, the perks here, you're going to want to use Refreshing Toast, again, the most essential one. This is vital. This means that you can use your potions more often, so really important to have that. Refreshing, again, is another very useful perk, and then other perks you can use, Regenerating, Purifying Toast, Nimble, and Healthy Toast are all really solid options in terms of your earring perks. Okay, next we got Heartrunes. So there are a few great Heartrunes to use for your tank building PvE content. Generally, Brutal Grasping Vines is best in slot, because for ad pulls it's going to offer group utility and benefits, so that is going to be the primary one you want to use. When you get to boss fights, you might want to switch to something else, at which point you can use Stalwart or Greater Stoneform Heartrune. Those are very useful as well, especially in situations where you're taking a lot of damage, or maybe you're not with a very competent healer. That's when these ones, especially when Stoneform, becomes really good. So Grasping Vines generally really good, and also for ad pulls it's definitely the best, and then for boss fights you can switch it to Stoneform to go down a more defensive route. Okay, as a tank, you want to be able to maximize your ability to be able to tank, and you'll want to use a range of consumables that offer a number of boosts. So most of the consumables benefit your damage. Even as a newer tank, you should at least be using things like Minor House Trophies, since that's like a 9% increase of damage to a certain enemy type, depending on the expedition you're in, and they are very cheap to buy. Using weapon coatings and honing stones are also good damage increases and very cheap options as well, when using the lower graded items especially, but it's still extra damage. With potions, you should be using, you can use more than one potion. You can use health potions, you can use regeneration potions, and you can use ward potions all at the same time. So you should have all three of those slotted, because they can all be used at the same time. They're on 3 different cooldowns. They don't interfere with each other, so you can use them all. Things like incense is also good to use. Oakenflesh Balm and Gemstone Dust are less important, but it's good to carry a few around in case they're needed, but it's not always the case. So let's have a little look at the consumables. So food, there's obviously different types of food. The cheapest one I found is carrot cake, and so I usually adjust my attributes around using carrot cake. So I put my gear on, and then I look at what my stats are, I input my attributes, and then I use carrot cake because it's the cheaper one of the few of the different options. But we've got these foods here, you want to focus on food that offers some kind of strength or constitution. When it comes to potions, you want to be using ward potions, so Ancient Ward, Angry Earth Ward, Corrupted Ward, Lost Ward. You want to use those potions depending on the expedition once again. Those are really important for mutated expeditions, especially on bosses, to help you deal with the incoming damage. You can use as well infused health potions, no reason not to use them. And also, like when you're in fights with lots of damage, having that tick of regen from the regeneration potions is also really nice. When doing expeditions, you want to be using weapon coatings. This is free damage. And because you have the light and heavy attack as a tank to maintain your threat, to maintain your aggro, you might as well be doing more damage. There's no reason not to be doing more damage as a tank. So using Ancient Coatings, Angry Earth Coating, Corrupt Coating and Lost Coating, when you enter an expedition, you should apply the relevant coating to the relevant enemy type of that expedition, and you apply it to your weapon because it's free additional damage. There's no reason for you not to do it. Even if you can't craft or afford to buy the infused coatings, use the lower ranked ones. It's still really, really useful. So obviously if you use an infused coating, that's going to give you 15% more damage to the enemy. However, if you take the lesser ones, you're still going to do more damage. It's just going to be a slightly less percentage, but it's still worth using. The next thing that's basically essential is honing stones. So using one of these stones at the start of an expedition gives you increased damage throughout. So you don't need to apply this to both weapons. It's just a general buff. There's no reason not to use one. Even as a tank, it's additional, easy, extra damage. And then even if you just use the common ones, you're going to get yourself an increase of 5% more damage. Obviously, if you can afford the more expensive ones, the powerful ones are only 7%, so having 5% from a common one, there's no reason not to use a common honing stone because they're not that expensive to make for the sake of getting 5% increased damage. Really, really worthwhile. With the trophies, again, you've got the minor combat trophies. No reason not to use them. You can pick them up for 200 gold. So you can place one of each trophy per house and you can own 3 houses. So essentially, if you put a minor combat trophy in each of your 3 houses, that's going to give you 6% increased damage for nothing. It's just there. You've got the trophies in your houses. Even if it's just the minor ones, you're going to be doing a nice amount of extra damage. Obviously, if you take the major combat trophies, they're 5% each. So you're going to do 15% more damage just by placing some trophies in your house. So you want to, again, match these to the specific enemy types. If you're fighting ancients in Lazarus, then you want to put the ancient combat trophies in your house, and that's going to give you increased damage to those enemies. So this is not something that you should avoid. You should absolutely get this because it's too easy not to do it. Next, you've got incense, and this is where the things start to get less important. So you can use this. It increases your damage for a certain amount of time. So if you use common incense, for example, you're going to get increased resistance to all afflictions by 30 for 15 minutes. If you use the powerful ones, it's going to be 50 for 30 minutes. These are a good way to increase your overall resistance to everything, and you can use them to assist with reducing your incoming damage. You've got Oak Flesh Balm, which reduces your damage, your physical damage elements. So when you're dealing with physical damage, you could use those, and it can be used to give increased absorption to physical damage types. So this can be really, really useful for that. And then obviously Gemstone Dust is the opposite. It gives you damage absorption to elemental damage. So that, guys, is how you set up my New World tank build. We're going to have more information on how to tank things more specifically with guides and information and videos. Those are on the way once we kind of have progressed and started to do really good scores in the M10 mutations and things. We're going to go over those in more detail as we progress. And this build, like I said before, really, really good build to use. That's how you put it together, and that's how it kind of functions. We're going to have more details on specific tank topics for New World in the coming weeks, so make sure you check those out as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.